thanks for having me for this event. I'm been looking forward to it. Big fan of Finland, particularly the work you've been doing in experimentation over the last couple of years. It's been a role model for a lot of other countries around the world. So really appreciate being here and having the opportunity to have this conversation. I'm going to see if this laptop works, first of all, and then secondly, I'm going to try to talk a little bit about our work that we are currently doing with a program called State of Change, but also I'm going to talk a little bit beyond that, and hence the title here, which is Platforms for Public Innovation and Future of Government Capacity. Because one of the questions that I've also been discussing with the Sitra Lab is how do we deal with the problems we're facing, and how do we think about the role of government in doing so, but also more broadly, are we actually seeing the role of government sort of play out in the way that we want to see at the moment? So my background for asking that question is 7 or 8 years in the Danish government in the place called Lab, which was the former government innovation lab there. And now 4 years, almost 4 years at Nesta, working with governments around the world, seeing this challenge play out over and over again. So hopefully we can have a bit of discussion about what that looks like, also in your context. I'll put on sort of a bit of an agenda. I'll talk 5 more minutes, sort of a bit of an intro, talk a little bit about State of Change and Nesta. Then it would be great to hear from you guys. So we've sort of set up a little bit of a reflection exercise, 5 minutes or so, just amongst yourselves to hear a little bit about more where you're coming from. And then I'll go into more detail about both, I guess, what's our current assumption about this question of government capacity for the future. And on top of that, how can we think about that in relation to the challenges we're facing, particularly when it comes to the public innovations that we need to enable. So that's all right. I'll go into it. Is the sound okay? No? Higher, lower, higher? It's a bit of an echo as well, I think. Can you say something? Sorry.
Can you say something?
Yes, I can say something. Is that all right? Can you hear me?
Yes.
I feel sorry for you guys in the back. You won't be able to see anything on the screen, but hopefully it will make sense anyway. Otherwise, there are still spots in the front, so please do come forward. So a few things about Nesta, for those of you that don't know. Nesta is the UK Innovation Foundation, as its core mandate. This is basically our tagline: we bring bold ideas to life to change the world for good. And Nesta works across a number of priority fields to fund research, deliver programs to explore new horizons when it comes to innovation broadly in society. Current priority areas is around health education, around innovation policy, creative industries, and then government innovation as a bit of a core pillar in that. And Nesta, the main mandate is in the UK, but increasingly over the years, Nesta's been working as a global foundation as well, partnering with governments and private industry and foundations around the world with that same question in mind, and recognizing that obviously, because we're all learning about this emerging field, we need to learn from basically everywhere and be able to work with those organizations and people as well. And Nesta is a bit of a hybrid beast. We do a lot of different things around innovation methods. We try to make those happen through either, as I said before, research or communications, events, and so on, but also through building dedicated expertise units. Excuse me. Could be the Alliance for Useful Evidence. That's a bit of an expert center for how we actually use data and evidence better in decision making. Or it could be something like the Innovation Skills team that I'm a part of, which is trying to specialize in actually becoming really rigorous about how we build innovation skills and capacity to deal with the problems we're facing. And I think it's sort of in a simplistic way, there are sort of three levels that we are trying to address. We are trying to raise the awareness when it comes to emerging technologies and methods and tools and approaches. We're trying to explore different ways of making innovation happen. That could be in government, but also in society or in communities. And then we're thinking a lot about, this is particularly related to this conversation today, about building capabilities. So when it actually has started to emerge and happen, and obviously in government at least, you see that often in the emergence of innovation teams and labs and programs and funds and so on. And I would guess that it's often your experience that it still very much happens in pockets or in a bit of a wave. Sometimes something great happens, but then there's a bit of a vacuum and so on. I think our question is, how do we go beyond that? How do we go beyond the lab, the team, the project, the program, to actually make it a part of the way we work and make it so as if it becomes embedded in our sort of policies and our regulation efforts and so on. Excuse me. So it's not, we're doing design and innovation over here, and then we do policy and programs over here, but actually you bring those two together and you explore what that means in terms of generating better outcomes. And this is basically where Stage of Change, which I've been spending the last 3 or 4 years of my life working on, comes into play. Stage of Change is essentially two things. On the one hand, it's a global innovation learning platform, recognizing that a lot of people and organizations around the world are in this same space around government innovation, actually, interested in how we actually can transform how government operates for the better. But instead of having all these dispersed efforts, is there actually a way of linking up those efforts in a bit of a learning, a more dedicated learning environment? So the first thing that Stage of Change is trying to enable a learning collective among this community of practice. And then the second thing is to turn that learning into practical curriculum. So we work with governments around the world to rehearse that curriculum, to deliver it, and to see if we can find new ways of building that formerly mentioned capacity that is needed. So in the last couple of years, for example, we worked with the Canadian government, the Australian government, governments in South America, and a few governments here in Europe as well, on those sort of dedicated efforts. We can get back to that as well. But essentially what that means is that we are trying to think about basically what are the theories of change around capacity building. Because I do think, for me at least, there's an underdeveloped field there. Like, we talk a lot about the tools and the methods, we talk a lot about labs and teams and so on, but it becomes maybe too simplistic when it comes to actually foster what some people call culture change in government. So what does that actually look like? How do we do it? And for that reason, we are trying to partner with organizations and governments around the world to foster that learning environment, and equally, we are trying to constantly build a faculty of practitioners, because we believe that this learning that needs to happen can't be something that we can read in books. It's not the normal sort of cognitive learning where you could go in the classroom and learn about the thing and then go out and do it. We actually need to learn continuously from the people doing the work. So, excuse me. So we are trying to build this curriculum on an ongoing basis, learning from the leading practitioners within government innovation. Some of these are there. So, and why are we doing this? I'm not going to spend a huge amount. You mentioned it already. There are problems we're facing, whether they're climate change or infrastructure or all the other things that you're very familiar with, that we, talk about as complex issues, public problems. The difficulty of addressing them is not new. I think the recognition that actually we could do a better job. Thank you. And that the pace of change is also rising. So the uncertainties are only, increasing. The unknowns are only increasing. and we have more and more stakeholders also involved in dealing with them. And at the same time, when you're dealing with this sort of interdependency between causes and drivers of those issues, and I think many of you would know that or recognize the experience that government tends to often work on the symptoms of problems rather than the causes of them. How do we shift that balance? And also, when it's actually, if we really are honest about it, it's impossible to know how things will play out. And when we do intervene into the real world, how do we deal with that premise in a more productive way? So in a way, if these problems are insolvable to some degree, can we build up another way of dealing with them, another way of responding on a continuous basis, rather than pretending that we can sort of come up with a big solution and then we go on to the next thing. So I think in a way that sets out a new premise, if you sort of really see the world as complex. And the other element that goes a little bit beyond the public problems as they're usually talked about is obviously the political and democratic development all over the world. Probably less of an issue in Finland, but certainly the place where I live, there is a bit of an issue currently around this. But you are seeing the bigger divisions in the nation states. You are seeing the question of people trusting their the public officials and the politically elected and so on. I think that problem seems only to be on the rise at the moment. So there is a sense of urgency that we should really be committed to around redesigning government from that angle as well. So all of that, I think, comes into a question for me around public legitimacy. And I think this is this quote is reflecting an experience that we've seen in every government we work with, that people are fundamentally questioning the tools and the processes and even the skills to some degree and the professional expertise. Not that people are not doing a good job in many respects, but people are starting to question whether they actually, are they fit for the role that they have? Should they have been taught other things? Are the organizational structures actually, functioning in the right way, and so on. So there's a lot of fundamental questions going on, which is a very interesting time to be in the space but certainly also a very scary time to some degree. So with that in mind, I'm sort of curious about where you're coming from on this question of public legitimacy. So I've asked, I've been allowed to ask these two questions by the organizers here, and I'll get you to reflect on sort of 5 minutes with the person next to you, maybe. One question is around, what are the crucial factors when it comes to creating or maintaining government legitimacy? And here I'm thinking about maybe the Finnish context or the context you're working in. And then secondly, building on that, what kind of government capacities are crucial to develop in order to make it happen? It was just some very open questions, just to get your mind going, and have a bit of a quick conversation with the person next to you for 5 minutes about some of the most important elements you see relating to these questions. And then we'll continue from there. Is that all right? Okay, 5 minutes. So appreciate those, and obviously want to hear much more from you guys, but just as a bit of a primer for me also to see where your heads are at, that was really useful. We'll return to all of those questions, I can promise you, and we'll have more time in discussion a bit later on as well. Now I've been told that I have to say hello to the people that are joining in soon. So hello. Hopefully you can all hear us, and great to have you with us online as well. So we'll continue after this quick reflection exercise. I'll go into talk a little bit in more detail about, I guess, where we're coming from. And I would quickly caveat this by saying, I don't necessarily have answers either to your point before. I think how we see our work, we're working from a bunch of assumptions that obviously is based on what we've been learning and experiencing, but we are still testing them. And I think that's basically all we can do, is like constant testing, developing and testing out of assumptions that hopefully prove to be valuable for the people who engage in our work. So I'll be testing these assumptions with you guys as well, and hopefully they will resonate. But question, first of all, what kind of government capacity? And obviously there are multiple ways to address that question. And maybe we could start here with this messy slide and say, you know, it's a messy space. You know, this conversation about innovation. Innovation methods and tools and approaches are constantly emerging. Some of you just mentioned some of them. And the challenge seems to be, to a lesser degree, to just take one of them and go for it, even though that seems to be sometimes what governments tend to do. They tend to fall in love with one method, whether it's behavioral insights or data or design or something forth, and say, well, let's try to fix everything using this method, rather than, you know, building a capability to navigate this landscape. So as a decision maker, you probably don't have to be an expert in all of this, but you do have to be knowledgeable, I guess, about how do we actually generate the best kind of intelligence when it comes to the issue we're facing. How do we become better at developing solutions in multiple different ways and testing them over time? How do we become better at mobilizing talent? And how do we become better at using various kinds of technologies in those processes as well? And this seems to be the navigation of this messy methods landscape that is a part of the job description these days when it comes to government capacity and public servant capability. And it's not an easy task, and it's not a very rewarding task, I think. But it does highlight the need for, more than ever, I think, public decision makers becoming stewards of change that are able to oversee this landscape and that are able to not least articulate the value of doing something and figure out, you know, what is the problem we're facing actually called for? What's the mix of methods? What methods are you using and at what times in the process and so on? And what does those methods actually do when it comes to maybe translate some of the roles and functions that we currently work on? So how does design actually change how policymaking works, for example? I think that's a real challenge, and I think that's a real sort of change in terms of what's currently being, I guess, sometimes talked about as what is the new thing, where are we going in terms of the skills and the methods that you know, we are meant to be uptaking. So it's not one method, but it's actually a plethora of methods. And I think the second thing, or building on that, I think what we are seeing is the need then with that messy landscape to simplify. And this is, again, our working assumption. We are sort of at the moment claiming that all of those methods you just saw are basically working on the dimensions that are shown on the slide. So some of them are helping us reframe or rediscover what the problem is, getting to the issue, getting to the cause of the issue potentially. And on the other side of that dimension, some of them are helping us develop new solutions. So whether that's creatively thinking about other ways of developing in the process, prototyping and so on, or whether that's actually beginning to use AI or other technologies as sort of enablers of new solution spaces. And similarly, a lot of those methods are helping us generate better facts, or at least maybe make better use of the facts that are already there. And so using evidence and data in a much more proactive and useful way. And a lot of those methods are helping us to explore the future. Hopefully not just one future, but actually multiple possible futures. So, you know, foresight and other things that are, I guess, enabling us to go into that bit of an uncertain sort of future and environment. And again, there's a dimension there between what we know and what we want to explore. And then the final axis, which is about people and systems, a lot of those, I think maybe most of them actually helps us understand better what people's experiences are and build empathy. Obviously, a lot of the design led innovation is sort of revolving around that, in combination with having a more holistic view, which is taking the systems view. And I know there's quite a few system thinkers in the group as well today. So it's not going to come as a surprise, but I do think what is useful for us about this in the conversation, and this is particularly useful when we start working with new projects and new sort of participants and cohorts and so on, is that it helps sort of, it's a bit of a check-in. It's like, what do we actually assume? And you go around these dimensions and say, well, are there things that can help us generate or reframe the problem? Are there things that can help us make better use of the data and so on? And then you have a look at what methods and tools are available to us, and you make choices based on that. But if you don't choose the method, you actually have a bit of a sense-making around the issue beforehand. So I think for me and for us, this is part of what is the future government capacity, to actually be able to toggle on these dimensions on an ongoing basis. And then the third thing I'd say on that topic to begin with is based on some of the research we've done that produced this competency framework, which is a really boring thing, I know. And sorry for talking in length about it, but I do think it's a critical thing. And it was something when I started at Nesta 4 years ago that we decided right away that we needed to help create a bit of a language around what public servants are meant to be doing, both from a sort of, let's understand what sorts of skills and competencies that might be more relevant than others, but also to recognize, which came out through the research. We did some research with around 30 innovation teams from around the world, to also to sort of take a bigger stake in the ground and say, you know, are we actually emphasizing when it comes to the behaviors we'd like to see, and what is the relationship between something that also came up a lot, which was about mindsets and attitudes, as opposed to methods and tools. So we've tried to build and synthesize this data into this framework, and there's a bunch of tools related to this, and we just published a practice guide that links to it as well. But one thing that came out was that it may be that it's more about the team than the individual at this point. Not that the individual skills are not important, but first, as a starting point, you actually need to think about what does the team possess. Hence, why we have the team in the middle. We are framing the framework around experimenting and public problem solving, which again is trying to focus on the activity. It's not about sort of innovation, this and that, or hype, this and that. It's actually about, well, so what is the activity that we want people to do more of? That's at least the attempt that we've sort of set forth. And then from that, the areas, the sort of main areas, as you can see them, you know, it's not rocket science. Like basically everyone would look at that and say, well, we're sort of almost doing that already. You know, collaboration is really important to us. You know, leadership of change is really important to us. And obviously we are on an ongoing basis sort of trying to learn about the different things. I think the main point for us with this framework was also to sort of really make explicit that, you know, again, when we talk about innovation in government, it often relates to the purple side. It's often, again, relates to the methods, but also the ways that you can generate new learning, which is really important. But what often gets underestimated, I guess, is the two other dimensions, particularly around collaboration, working together, and how important that is to lead change, given the public problems and that we talked about before, but also, not least, when it comes to actually making change happen, what are some of the sort of traits and characteristics that takes around leading change, around navigating the environment, around mobilizing resources, around entrepreneurship, around storytelling, and so on. All of that is really crucial to actually make stuff happen. And interestingly, when it came out in terms of the data, what came back the most, one was outcomes focus as an important trait. One was empathy, And then the third one was storytelling, which for me was a bit of a surprise. But when you think about what it actually takes to mobilize or make the case for whether that's using a new way of working or new method, you actually have to make the case for that and tell the story about what that thing can do to persuade your manager or whoever. But also obviously the story around the change you're then trying to create in that particular policy area you work in. But over and above all of that, as I mentioned before, what came out of this research was that mindsets beats methods every time. So you can be very technically skilled and have a high level of expertise, but if you're applying that with the wrong mindset and attitude, you're not going to get anywhere. So the challenge I think we are posing to governments when we work with them currently is to say, well, if you want to redo HR, if you want to think differently about incentivizing, we need to come up with better ways of understanding and enabling and assessing the mindsets that people have. So in this case, the center here came out particularly around curiosity, about imagination, resilience, empathy, agility, and so on. And obviously, some of that you can recruit for, and some of that, you might have to recognize, well, we don't have that. There's a deficiency. But I would argue most of the times it's about activating it. I think it's already kind of there. As you can see, these are not weird traits. These are basically human traits. So the argument we often make is that the organizations we built is sort of under prioritizing them, and we need to find ways of reprioritizing them, getting back to actually activating them as a part of the professional way you do things, the professional identity, and the professional expertise. So we've been trying to do that in a number of programs and really emphasize that at least on a longer term basis, is the journey we need to take in order to invest in our organizations. Yeah. I want to just check if there's a burning question on this one. Does this resonate? It's completely bollocks, as they would say in the UK. No. All right, we can return to it. This was just to put some frames in your minds, so we'll return to most of these at the end. So when it then comes to thinking, so there was a few takes there on the government capacity as we are currently wanting to build it. So one around sort of what kinds of people is it, one around sort of what kind of capability, and what might be sort of the mental frame that is really important, both on an individual and team level, but also in a way on an organizational and strategic level. Then I want to go into talking about governments as platforms for public innovation. It's a bit of a detour in the sense that it's also a bit of a critique of the current innovation landscape, if you will. Because, and this is my framework that I'm again testing with you, we are seeing, when it comes to innovation in government, some fields that are emerging. And don't hang me up on sort of the specific language here, but I hope you get my drift here. So there's one around public sector innovation, which I think is very much related to building, capacity within the system. There's one around policy innovation, which is about, new ways of transforming public service systems. There's one around social innovation, which is more related to, bottom-up sort of solutions. I'll return to this. There's one around which is relating to this conversation about democratic engagement and actually getting the people more involved in decision making and so on. And I would argue that these fields are not entirely not interrelated, but are growing on their own terms. And I think that's on the one hand really important, but there's also a bit of an issue there, which I'll return to. But I'll just introduce them very quickly through a couple of examples. So I've started here with policy innovation in the sort of systems solutions phase. And I think we are seeing a bunch of work in government relating to this, thinking in new ways about how we can create and implement policies that can transform public service systems. One of the examples I often use is this from Mexico City called Mapaton. Probably most of you heard about it. Certainly it was featured in the OECD report from the Edge of Government a couple of years ago. What is interesting about this example, I think, is that in Mexico City, they have a horrible infrastructure, and they have a huge amount of people using the public transport every day. It's a special place insofar as a lot of this is informal, and how there's a big issue in terms of government actually. How do we make this better? Where do we start? And there was this discussion some years ago about, well, if we want to invest some money, should we hire some people to go out and try to map these? Normally that kind of project would be fairly large in terms of in terms of actually the sort of investment that would take. They hired in the lab of Mexico City instead, which they suggested to say, well, why don't we activate the citizens themselves to do this? And why don't we do it in a way where it becomes a bit of a game, it becomes a bit of a competition, becomes something that the citizens themselves can own. So within 2 weeks, 4,000 citizens mapped over 50,000 kilometers with the sole amount of $15,000, as opposed to the millions that they would have been spending on a normal traditional program. And they were continuously doing this. This was not a one-off. This is still happening. And the interesting thing now is that once now the data that they've now visualized in a number of different ways are becoming available, it's also still open. So basically it's open for businesses and entrepreneurs to come up with different transport solutions to basically help co-create the new sort of the transport system of Mexico City of the future, which hopefully can be more inclusive, because right now, 2 to 4 hours of commute every day for a lot of the families to go to work and so on is not really a sustainable way of living, or at least not a desirable one. So I think here you can sort of see an example of a very simple focus on activating people as part of the policy development that has a huge potential to really fundamentally change the transport system in this case, and also obviously make the solution much more cheap in the process. And to that point about trust, I think this is the way to actually create the relationship to the people you're trying to serve in the process. On the other axis around sort of the social innovation, which I've sort of named developing new business models from the bottom up. An example I'm always fond of is from Canada, working out of Vancouver, a place, an outfit called English Forward. They created Kudos, which is, as it says here, hundreds of splendid learning experiences. It's a part of it is an online platform, which is a big component here. The issue that they're trying to tackle is around mental disability. So basically, they've been seeing, and you could see that sort of in statistics as well, that there's a lot of offers when it comes to mental disability for people in their youth and their young childhood. But when they hit 19, those offers go away. So basically from there on, they just get, home service like food, cleaning, and so on. So they start to regress, both their quality of life, but also their sort of learning and their sort of general well-being as a part of that. So what Kudos aims to do, and how it went about it, was to say, well, why don't we set up design studios within the very institutions where these mentally disabled people are spending their days. That could be in a place like this. This is a bit of a community center, but they also spend a lot of time in people's homes, figuring out what are they actually doing every day, and are there things that we are overlooking that we can actually leverage as a resource. And Kudos is then trying to leverage that through a number of interventions that sort of relating to the learning experiences I mentioned before. It is essentially, it's just pairing what already is in the local community, whether that's the pet shop owner, whether that's the karate instructor, whether that's the English teacher, that are wanting to giving something back. And those people are generating learning experiences which they make available online. And then the mentally disabled people can connect up and make use of these learning experiences on an ongoing basis. So suddenly, and very quickly in this case, hundreds of learning experiences were generated, and suddenly begin to have all these new interactions in the local community to activate people that actually want to help, while the mentally disabled get a reward from actually that engagement. And over time, the mentally disabled themselves get involved in actually generating learning experiences as well. So it's not finished, but it's a different way of engaging with a really difficult and vulnerable target group, which I know in every Western country at least is an issue. And it's a lightweight way of actually generating a policy solution that are in the terms of the local community and the target audience themselves. But it's certainly also a very different logic when it comes to policy development. It's not happening in the office and being written up and then put to the minister and then delivered and then expected for reality as it is out there to sort of respond in the right way. This was built out there, and now the challenge, which I'll get back to again, for the more sort of formal system is to actually respond to this. So if we actually have this new intervention that is built on the terms of target audience, what's the implications for the wider public service system? How can we link up to some of this and make more of this happen that is building on the resilience and the resources of the local community? Around sort of civic innovation, I'll go quickly now. I've called it building social resilience and collective intelligence. I think we've seen a lot of examples going into this space as well. One is around sort of how we activate people again, to a little bit related to the former point. An example of that is Good Sam, which some of you may know of, which is basically trying to tackle the challenge of emergency response. So at least in London, but also in other cities around the world, one of the more frequent causes of death is actually the ambulance is not getting to the scene quick enough. So the question is, how do we tackle that issue? Is it a problem of infrastructure? Is it a problem of resources in the health system, and so on? And there was a while back, there was a lot of debate around what sort of intervention are we really talking about. And a part of that conversation then resulted in this project around Good Sam, which is essentially saying, well, recognizing that we already have a lot of citizens that know first help response. How do we actually make use of that? Or can we make use of that? Is there a viable business case, if you will, around actually getting citizens that are close to the scene coming to help? So what Good Sam is essentially is just an app that people have on their phones and they subscribe to if they know first help response. So when something happens, they get a choice. They get activated. If they're one of the 3 people that are closest to the scene, they get activated, and they can choose to go and help. It's not without problems, but essentially what London's first help response map suddenly looks like is very different. It's suddenly very different coverage, and it has already been proven to help save lives on a number of occasions. So again, you're thinking differently about the collective resource, the collective intelligence. You're thinking differently about what sort of intervention, that it's not an entirely new reform of the health system or the transportation system, but it's developing a supplement that then you can build around. And it's helping to think about interventions not as one-offs, but as a way of investing into a resource that's already there. Obviously, ethically, and this is why it was set up as an experiment, to say, well, can we actually ask that of people? Can we actually make people help in sort of the health system? If you get it out on the app and you say, well, I actually don't have time right now, I'm here doing grocery shopping with my kid. Is that a position you want to put people into, for example? That's one ethical issue around it. So obviously these sorts of things need a lot of experimentation and testing to see if they're viable, how people respond to it. I think there's a lot of, to my knowledge, there's a lot of positive stories about citizens actually really contributing and feeling like they are really making a difference, which I think is probably one of the factors you want to see happen in that regard. Just a quick other example, which just to recognize that this civic innovation is not just about activating the collective resource, it's also about democratic innovation. And one of the democratic innovations that I'm most inspired by at the moment is in Taiwan, where they've been doing a systematic public deliberation around a number of complex issues. And one of the things they're testing is that sort of online environment where people can deliberate around these complex issues. So it's not just making the decision of getting the right answer, it's actually facilitating a better debate about what's possible, which I think is a part of the public legitimacy which we talked about before. And then you can get to, certain, as you can see here, certain percentages around what, where does people gravitate to? Where in a way, where is the collective sense making taking us? And then the decision makers can take that input and say, well, suddenly we can sort of recognize the different perspectives, the tensions, and so on in a much more proactive way. We can turn to that example as well if you want. And then finally, public sector innovation, which I think is probably, at least the last couple of years, been the more, at least in my knowledge, the more prominent one in terms of people's desire to have a look at it. And that is basically focusing on changing how government's operating, whether that's skills and competencies, but also other sort of core functions of government. And this is where we've done bulk of our work, going back to this sort of messy landscape. How are these methods and tools potentially changing how government's operating, but also what's the bigger picture? And for us, when we work in this space, we are talking, or we're talking about the difference between methods and craft. And obviously craft, in a sense, is just the successful delivery or execution of methods in a sense, but we are sort of seeing it as a bit more than that. Because yes, I think it's really useful to start with the methods and tools. It enables, to facilitate new processes, take on new approaches. But when it comes to actually changing how government's operating, the focus on the left-hand side, the cultural aspect. So what are those methods actually turning into in terms of principles that guide your work on an everyday basis? How does human-centered design offer something different on an ongoing basis when you do your job? So it's not just a human-centered design project, but it's actually a new way of engaging people. So every time we do something, we should adopt some principles about, well, have we actually engaged the public in the right way around this issue, for example. And similarly, on the right-hand side, how are we thinking productively about how these new ways of working embed themselves within the organizational environment? Are we proactively building the conditions and spaces, both for trying them out, but also to actually embed them? and also how do they then translate into functions, procedures, roles within that environment. And I think for me, that seems to be the biggest underestimation currently when it comes to allowing for the time and space for that learning process, the organizational learning process that needs to adopt new ways of working. And because it's not going to show the value after 3 or 6 months, it has to be an ongoing process. So one of the conversations we are having with governments is like, what does that investment look like? What's the learning journey that you can sort of count on, saying, well, what are the intermediary outcomes that you might see along the way? What are some of the signs of success and so on? Because otherwise we will be stuck in the project paradigm and not really rehearse the future of how governments could be operating. And this is essentially what we've been doing in State of Change around the world. I mentioned a couple of the countries before. One example I just want to highlight is our recent work with the Canadian government, working with the Government of Canada Entrepreneurs, which is a new initiative, which is basically a cross-departmental team working on cross-cutting issues. They work under the mandate of public sector innovation, which is a bit of a sort of a top-down thing, but it's really useful because it puts innovation on the agenda and enables something like this to happen, which is not just sort of using new approaches and methods to deal with systems transformation issues, but it's actually an attempt to organize horizontally in government. A team that consists of 18 different departments, people from 18 different departments organized as a team that shares a project portfolio of not all of them, but some of the issues that departments themselves can't solve. They chose in this case to just focus on 2 things overall, which they call system transformation. One was disruptive technologies. So again, the use of blockchain, for example, it's not one department's job to figure out how government should be doing that. It's actually a cross government challenge. And the other thing was core functions like HR, procurement, for example, for 2 of them, and saying, well, can we as this team actually working on developing a new HR system that ensures better support of personnel, but also better mobility and so on within the Canada Public Service. So I think that is a really interesting way of setting that up, because on the one hand, it was as a sort of a professional development platform. This is rehearsing new ways of working. But on the other hand, what they're also doing at the same time is rehearsing what a future capacity might look like. So whether that's the portfolio approach to projects, actually seeing, having a bigger challenge around systems transformation, but then seeing the project portfolio as a portfolio of experiments that address that in different ways. Whether that's the horizontal ways of organizing, suddenly you're sort of challenging the linear sort of top-down logic, but actually say, well, in order to do collaborative problem solving, we need to organize ourselves differently. They also try to define this role beforehand, so they had basically an assumption or hypothesis about, we need to create a new sort of definition of what the public servant role should be. So they chose the policy entrepreneur as a sort of a frame for that, or a descriptor of that. But it was very deliberate, I think, in terms of saying, it's good to have an institutional anchor, and so we could begin to actually see what that looks like. So essentially what the cohort was doing to say, well, was give meat on that bone, was to illustrate both what's possible and what's doable, but certainly also testing the organizational environment and readiness about, are we actually ready to work in new ways? If not, what are the barriers in doing so? So it's quite an interesting one where, capacity building goes beyond the training element, and actually you set up an environment with the elements around both skills and capability building, but also focusing it still on prioritized strategic issues, not, innovation holidays on the fringe of what government is doing. So it shows the value of doing something different relating to core strategic issues. And then you tie that into different ways of trying to rehearse what the institutional transformation might be or should be in that regard. So all of that was to paint a bit of a picture and say there are many things happening, particularly on a project basis and in spurts and pockets around the world, and there are certainly high levels of ambition that we can tap into. What I would argue is missing, this is where sort of coming back to the public innovation concept, is that these seems to be only getting so far. So when we talk about changing how government's operating, it's very much within a fairly confined space around capability building. Sometimes it, as I mentioned before, it could be more institutional, but it's fairly siloed in that sense. You know, policy innovation, there are certainly approaches emerging around transforming public service systems, but it sort of rarely leads to real governance innovation, where actually it sort of becomes the way you operate. Around social innovation, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, that you have all this potential coming from very local parts, well, communities or local municipalities, that you would like to really bring into the fore and become more strategic about, but it rarely happens. And equally, when it comes to democratic innovation and sort of civic innovations, where you actually successfully engage the public differently, it's very much often on a very local level. It's not, you know, reflected in how we have the next election or how politicians are working with bureaucracies or other organizations and so on. So my argument or my question really, are we at a time where we should unsilo some of these innovation conversations? I think we are. That's my sort of interest, at least. And I think we are, for the reasons that, you know, it's not enough to just be focusing on redesigning government if we don't do it in a way that relates to how we redesign the political. So democratic innovations, you know, should be much more reflected in terms of how we think about bureaucracy, for example. And equally, when we talk about the capacity of government, the institution innovation and the governance innovation, you know, whether that you can sort of see that as the organizational change and the sort of process innovation in a way, thinking new ways about policy and so on, are equally a part of that. One of the experiences that I had in my time at MindLab in Denmark was that the relation, like the biggest barrier to really significant change was the relationship between the politicians and the bureaucracy and the civil servants. And we came a long way in actually redesigning how, for example, we worked with the department, the Ministry of Employment, to redesign how the ministry worked around citizen engagement, around design, and so on. But then at some point we hit a wall where the next thing that needed to change was how the dynamic between the politicians and the bureaucracy was working. Our colleagues, the public servants in the ministry, saying, well, we can see that, but that's not, we can't touch it. Like, that's not on the table. So you know, we are public servants, we can't be making suggestions about parliamentary processes or how politicians or political debates are being had and when and so on. But that was essentially, from an outcomes-focused perspective, what made sense. We have to look at how the politicians are collaborating with the public servants. Right now, in that logic, they were very much the bureaucrats were sort of giving briefs, and the politicians were saying, well, that's not exactly what I want. Here's another brief, go work on it, come back, and then they come back with something different. So very much sort of transactional. It was not very collaborative. As this is again just one example. So I think it's really hard to think about redesigning government and building capacity if we don't think about how that relates to redesigning the political. Anyway, it's a sort of a broad framework. It's just a sort of moment in time in terms of thinking. But I do think relating also to what Sitra is working on in the lab around systems change, around dealing with complex issues, it's very much a conversation as well. That I think all of these sort of innovation silos needs to come together in a much more interrelated and dynamic way. So I'll end on a note there. So platforms for public innovation, the future of government capacity. I think we need to go beyond the public sector renewal conversation. And then I think the first step, which it's the final framework I'll throw at you, is about embracing an experimental mindset. And I actually was reminded that you guys in Finland are way ahead in terms of doing that. But I do think when it's a massive challenge, and whatever we do, I think starting with embracing as experimental mindset to go on that journey to begin to become more experimental about those interconnections is really crucial. And I think it's crucial because it's not, and we can see it on the framework as well, it's not a risk management exercise. It's not where we know a lot of the probabilities, and we just need to manage those in order to actually make it work, because we don't know what the solutions are. We don't have a hypothesis that we can just go out and validate. We just have to affirm what we already know. We are very much on the left-hand side of this framework, which is much more about exploration, very much about solutions that are unknown, and we need to be shaping new directions when it comes to this. And we need to be asking the question, what if, and thinking about experimentation not as a sort of a way of legitimizing what we already want to do, but actually as a way of exploring new possibilities. So yeah, I'll end on that note, and hopefully there's some food for thought for discussion as well. Thank you. So what time is it?
It's 9:45.
9:45. Oh wow.